Hi, everybody. This is David Wheatley for David Wheatley's very own podcast, episode 15. We're recording this on May the 18th, 2022. And as close to Hollywood as we can be without actually being in Hollywood, but if we had to, we could claim it as Hollywood adjacent. So it's good to be with you again today. And today's topic is the relationship between classical music and jazz music. And I happen to have had a foot in each camp for a long time. Prior episodes, we've discussed social psychology with the 5 different areas: individuals, dyads, groups, individuals versus groups, and groups versus groups. So, as much as I would like to think that the classical people and the jazzers get along just fine, one group each, it's not always been my experience. No, it has not. I go immediately to North Texas State University, now called the University of North Texas, where I would play in a lab band, which was an 18-piece or maybe more jazz band, 5 trumpets, 5 trombones, 5 saxophones, piano, guitar, bass, drums, and occasionally percussion. That probably adds up to 19, plus a conductor riding herd on this group of wild jazz maniacs in the most positive sense. I would play with them at 3, and then when I was lucky enough to do so, I would play with the symphony after that, or play with a percussion ensemble playing classical music. So, how did this happen that we ended up with classical music and with jazz music concurrently? Well, the classical people are descended from notated music. Gregorian chant, we talked before about having one line across the piece of paper or parchment as applicable, and that the notes would be written usually in the form of diamonds, not real diamonds, of course, ink diamonds, and the position on the line or above or below it would let the reader of the music know whether the note is higher or lower. And then from there, we ended up with staffs of music, and now we have the traditional, what has become traditional, the 5 lines. And then at the beginning of each of these staves, we put a clef, which tells us whether it's high notes, low notes, or middle notes. And that ability to write music and read music forms the basis of classical music. And so the people that write it and the people that play it have to, or get to, I'm going to say have to, learn the system to be able to know which note goes where, and to be sure, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the notes they're writing will come out sounding the way they want, which is how we ended up with composer control, that the composer would study all of the instruments and their ranges, high notes and low notes and middle notes, and how they read their individual parts, and the composer would learn how to write those parts on a master score that has everybody's part. And so the segment of society that is scientific and literary and is based on writing things down, allied very comfortably with notated music and classical music. So the classical composers and the classical musicians were able to play music that is much more consistently complex, meaning that it would sound almost exactly the same, no matter who played it or when they played it. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the jazzers were busy saying, we don't need no notations, and we don't want to do any notations, and we think we shouldn't have to write it down anyway. And even if we did, we think it's too stiff, and all those people up in their castles, hey, they can have their castles, but we want to be spontaneous and express ourselves. Thank you very much. And so the jazz people often learned music by listening to the way other people played it, called an oral tradition, where it was taught from father to son or mother to daughter and back and forth. And from that, the jazz musicians were able to learn this music and especially feel the emotions and the history and the culture that are conveyed within that music. There's a spontaneity to jazz, which I particularly enjoy. Oh, I should probably refer you to my website, davidwheatley.net, where you will find some music. There's a version of Autumn Leaves on SoundCloud, which is a good compromise between jazz and classical because the original theme, music, and the chords were written down classical music style, but the interpretation I've given to it is the jazz style improvised. I've found, generally speaking, that the jazzers are more welcoming of classical music than the classical world is welcoming of jazz. And I'll just pause for a moment of sadness about that. Many of the jazz musicians of today have also studied classical music, so some are able to play both. But most of the classical musicians who are specialists have chosen not to or not able to play jazz. Maybe they can play the written notes, but when it comes to the improvisation section, they're not able to do that to their satisfaction and probably nobody else's. So the jazz musicians have made excellent studio musicians throughout the years. In the days when the major studios, Fox and Warner Brothers and MGM, had studio orchestras, many of the musicians in there were classically trained but could also play jazz. That way, the producer of the movie could have the same musicians to play all styles of music, which was a great advantage. When I was doing studio work and playing in the studios, often the jazz and the lighter fare was done at the end of the session, and the rest of the classical musicians were allowed to leave early while the jazzers, like me, stuck around afterwards to lay down our spontaneous, emotional tracks. There may be some people out there who are looking to pick a fight, so take it somewhere else. But in the meantime, it's not that I'm saying there is no emotion in classical music, because there's obviously tons of emotion in classical music. It is just that the spontaneous expression of emotion that comes with jazz is its own kind of emotion. I'll say it that way. There, that ought to satisfy just about everybody. Satisfies me for now until I think about it more, but that's the way it is for right this moment. I really enjoyed at North Texas going back and forth with the different styles. It has been a bit confusing, though, to decide what kind of musician am I really. I started playing by ear by learning Hang On Sloopy and Louie Louie, as I mentioned before, House of the Rising Sun and All My Lovin' by the Beatles with an easy chord version. That's how I started with it, listening to music on records and learning how to play them at the piano by ear. There was some appreciation for playing by ear. If not, I wouldn't say that my family marveled at it, but my mother and her friends thought this was a special category of musician. Almost strange, odd, maybe even a little weird. Nevertheless, I had it, and I rolled with it. In 9th grade, there was an announcement that came over the PA saying that the other band director, music teacher, was forming a Tijuana Brass band, which now we would call a clone band, and the names of the instruments that he needed played or instrumentalists that he was announcing. So I found my way into the tech wing, the auto mechanics, electrical woodworking department. And way down in there, he had booked a room over one of the lunch hours, and I went in and played this Tijuana Brass music out of the book. And he played the trombone, and then I was in the Tijuana Brass group. And we played at assemblies, went out to the Rotary Club to do gigs, or the Kiwanis Club, depending on which one the principal or vice principal belonged to, and where they had assured all their fellow Kiwanians or Rotarians that they could absolutely bring a band to come and play from the high school, that they had infinite power to do so. and we were the ones that ended up doing that. So from that, I was able to read the chord symbols, which a lot of my classical friends refer to as guitar chords, and be able to play those, to read them, and then figure out what the notes were because the notes were written in the staves below. And then from that, there was big band music, which we called stage band in Canada. And that showed more complex chord symbols, 13ths, augmented 11ths, flat nines, augmented fifth chords, ninth chords. And from these, I was able to figure out what the chord symbols were and what were the notes in them. And that helped a great deal to move things along. So, what to do about classical or jazz music? Playing the organ, I spend a lot of time learning Bach, fugues, preludes and fugues, toccatas and fugues, along with all the pedal work. And that music, generally speaking, needs to be played exactly the way it was written, even though there is some latitude there, mainly in terms of how people could figure out what Bach actually wrote on the paper with pen and ink. But so that needs to be exact. There are rigorous performance requirements, and it's incumbent upon the performers of classical music all over the world to play it properly. And then meanwhile, back at the ranch, like I said, the jazzers are jamming way into the night, playing music that they want to play. And as that song in Steely Dan says, I'll play just what I feel. Learn to work a saxophone. I'll play just what I feel. That's what the jazzers are doing. And I like to play like that too. And that pause means this concludes episode 15. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to do these. I hope it's something of a pleasure to listen to them. I look forward to your feedback. Please feel free to become a patron of the arts, or become even more a patron of the arts, by subscribing to our Patreon. And the information is in the description below. And I welcome an email or two, davidwheatley10@gmail.com. Thank you very, very, very much for joining us. And that's it for today.